Welcome to the quiet world of dreams.
Tonight, imagine that you are standing on the deck of a sailing ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The year is 1872. There is no land in sight. Around you, the sea rises and falls in long, dark blue waves. The wind moves steadily through the ropes above your head, making them tighten, loosen, and quietly hum against the wooden mast. Somewhere ahead, another ship is moving across the water. At first, there is nothing especially unusual about it. Its sails are still raised. Its hull appears intact. It drifts beneath a pale winter sky, leaning slightly as the waves pass beneath it. Yet as you come closer, something begins to feel wrong. No one is standing at the wheel. No sailor moves across the deck. No voice answers when your crew calls out. The ship is not sinking. It has not been destroyed by fire. It does not appear to have survived a violent attack. It is simply sailing without its people. Inside, there are supplies, clothing, navigational instruments, and many of the ordinary objects required for a long voyage. But the captain is gone. His wife and young daughter are gone. Every member of the crew is gone. The small boat that might have carried them away is missing, and the last known record written aboard the ship is already several days old. You are now beside the Mary Celeste, and more than 150 years later, the question waiting inside its quiet cabins remains unanswered. Why would 10 people abandon a vessel that was still capable of crossing the ocean, settle into a comfortable position, allow the sounds around you to become a little more distant? Tonight, we will follow the Mary Celeste from the shipyards of Nova Scotia to the cold waters near the Azores. We will examine what was genuinely found aboard her, what was added to the story later, and what the surviving evidence may tell us about the final decisions made by Captain Benjamin Briggs and the people who traveled with him. There will be no sea monsters waiting in the darkness, and no supernatural answer offered as fact. Only a ship, an uncertain sea, and a sequence of human choices whose final moments were never recorded. On the afternoon of the 4th of December, 1872, the brigantine Dei Gratia was traveling eastward across the Atlantic. Some historical accounts place the encounter on the following day because of differences in nautical timekeeping and later reporting. The ship's own records and the evidence presented during the inquiry are the best guides we have. But even something as simple as the date has acquired a small layer of uncertainty. The Dei Gratia had departed New York for Gibraltar. Her captain was David Morehouse, an experienced mariner who had spent much of his life around merchant vessels. The crossing had been slow, the wind was uneven, and the winter Atlantic could change from calm water to difficult seas with little warning. That afternoon, the crew noticed a vessel several miles away. It was moving strangely. The unknown ship was sailing with some of its canvas raised, but it did not hold a steady course. It turned with the wind and wandered across the waves rather than moving with the deliberate direction expected from a properly handled vessel. Through a telescope, the sailors could see that no one appeared to be controlling it. The Dei Gratia altered course and gradually approached. As the distance closed, the men recognized the name painted on the other ship: Mary Celeste. Captain Morehouse knew the vessel. Only weeks earlier, Both ships had been in New York Harbor. The Mary Celeste had departed before the Dei Gratia and should have been much farther east by then, perhaps already nearing the end of her journey. Now she was drifting roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. Morehouse ordered his first mate, Oliver Deveau, to take a small boat across with another sailor. The sea was not perfectly calm. Reaching an unmanned vessel required care. The men had to bring their boat alongside the larger hull, wait for the rise of the water, and climb aboard without being struck between the two ships. When they reached the deck, there was no greeting. No one came out from below. The wheel was unattended. Some of the rigging was damaged, and several sails were either missing or hanging poorly. The main hatch was secure, although other openings allowed water and air into parts of the ship. The men began to search. They found no captain in his cabin, no officers in the chart room, no sailors in the forecastle where the crew normally slept. There was no trace of Sarah Briggs, the captain's wife, or their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. The ship's only lifeboat was gone. A rope, believed to have been associated with that boat, appeared to have trailed behind the vessel before breaking or being cut loose. The exact condition and purpose of the rope would later become one of many details interpreted in different ways. Below deck, Deveau found water in the ship. Not enough to prove that it was sinking, but enough to cause concern. Estimates made at the time suggested several feet had collected in the hold. One of the pumps was not functioning properly. Another had been taken apart, perhaps for inspection or repair. The sounding rod, used to measure the depth of water inside a ship, was found on deck. That small object would later matter. It suggested that someone aboard the Mary Celeste had recently been checking the water level. The ship's papers were missing, along with the captain's navigational instruments. The chronometer and sextant were not found. These were objects a captain would normally take into a boat if he intended to leave the vessel. Yet many personal possessions remained. Clothing was still stored aboard. The sailors' belongings had not been systematically removed. There was food and fresh water. The cargo remained in the hold. There was no clear sign that the crew had fought one another, and no reliable evidence of bloodshed. The ship was untidy and wet in places, but it was not the perfectly preserved floating dining room described in later stories. The often repeated image of warm food still sitting on the table does not come from the original evidence. No steaming meal waited for the boarding party. There were no cups of tea abandoned in the middle of being poured, no plates suggesting that the entire crew had disappeared between one bite and the next. Those details belong to later retellings. The truth was quieter. The Mary Celeste looked like a vessel whose occupants had prepared to leave, but it did not explain why. Deveau and his companion returned to the Dei Gratia and reported what they had seen. Captain Morehouse now faced a decision. The empty ship could be left adrift, perhaps to sink or collide with another vessel, or a small group from the Dei Gratia could board it and attempt to sail it to port. Bringing it in would also create a legal claim for salvage. Under maritime law, people who saved an abandoned vessel and its cargo could receive part of their value as a reward. The exact amount would be decided by a court. Morehouse chose to recover the ship. A small salvage crew boarded the Mary Celeste. The two vessels then continued separately toward Gibraltar, connected not by a rope, but by a shared destination and an unanswered question. For hundreds of miles, the men aboard the Mary Celeste lived inside the abandoned world of the missing crew. They slept near empty bunks. They handled ropes that other sailors had tied. They used a deck where a family had recently walked. The ship creaked around them at night, the same way any wooden vessel creaked as the hull shifted beneath the force of the sea. Nothing supernatural occurred. The ship continued to sail. And that may be the most unsettling part of the story. The Mary Celeste was not a ruined vessel marking the location of a disaster. She was a functioning ship from which every person had disappeared. To understand what happened in 1872, it helps to know the vessel before she acquired her famous name. The ship was built in Spencer's Island, a small community on the coast of Nova Scotia. She was launched in 1861 under another name, Amazon. Wooden merchant ships were common along the coast of British North America. They carried timber, grain, alcohol, coal, and many other goods between ports connected by the Atlantic. The Amazon was not built as a mysterious vessel. She was a practical, working ship. Her hull was made from local timber. Her decks were shaped by craftsmen who understood that a ship's strength came not from any single plank, but from many pieces fitted together closely enough to withstand years of movement. When she entered the water, she became part of an enormous commercial network. Ships like the Amazon connected farms, factories, warehouses, and cities. They moved through harbors crowded with shouting dock workers, horse-drawn carts, barrels, ropes, sails, and the smell of salt mixed with smoke. The Amazon's early history was not entirely peaceful. Her first captain became ill and died shortly after the vessel began her career. Later, the ship suffered collisions and damage. In 1867, she ran aground near Cape Breton Island and was badly damaged. She was eventually sold to American owners. After repairs and alterations, she was registered in the United States under a new name, Mary Celeste. There is no convincing evidence that the vessel was considered cursed by those who sailed her. Accidents, illness, and damage were all common in 19th century shipping. A wooden merchant vessel could survive groundings, storms, collisions, and changes of ownership without acquiring a supernatural reputation. The idea of a cursed ship grew mainly after the disappearance. By 1872, the Mary Celeste had undergone substantial rebuilding. She was larger than she had been at launch and capable of carrying a valuable cargo across the Atlantic. One of her owners was Captain Benjamin Briggs. Briggs was 37 years old. He came from a seafaring family in Massachusetts. Several of his brothers were captains, and the sea had shaped much of the family's working life. He was not an inexperienced man facing his first ocean crossing. He had commanded vessels before and had a reputation for seriousness and competence. Contemporary descriptions present him as religious, responsible, and cautious. For the voyage to Europe, Briggs did something that was not unusual for merchant captains. He brought his family. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, joined him aboard the ship. So did their young daughter, Sophia Matilda. Their older son, Arthur, remained in Massachusetts with relatives because he was attending school. Letters written before the journey do not suggest that Sarah expected danger beyond the ordinary risks of the sea. She described the ship positively and appeared comfortable with its arrangements. The captain's cabin offered more privacy than the sailors' quarters. There would have been wooden furniture, storage for clothing, and a small domestic space created within a working vessel. For Sophia, the ship may have seemed like a moving house. She was too young to understand navigation or cargo. She would have known the sound of her parents' voices, the rhythm of footsteps overhead, the movement of lamps after sunset, and the constant shifting of the floor beneath her. The crew consisted of 7 men. The first mate was Albert Richardson, an American sailor who had worked with Briggs before. The second mate was Andrew Gilling. Edward William Head served as steward and cook. The other 4 sailors were Volkert Lorenzen, Arian Martens, Gottlieb Gutschard, and Boy Lorenzen. Most were German. The men were considered capable and trustworthy. Nothing in the known record supports the idea that Briggs had knowingly hired a violent or undisciplined crew. Together with Benjamin, Sarah, and Sophia Briggs, 10 people would make the voyage. Their destination was Genoa, Italy. Their cargo was industrial alcohol. In early November 1872, the Mary Celeste waited at Pier 50 on the East River in New York. Around her, the harbor was crowded with movement. Steamships released smoke into the cold air. Smaller sailing vessels passed between larger hulls. Dock workers carried crates and rolled barrels across wooden piers darkened by water and years of use. The Mary Celeste was loaded with 1,701 barrels of alcohol. This was not drinking alcohol intended for taverns. It was industrial spirit, transported for commercial use. The barrels filled much of the hold. They were made from wood, held together by metal hoops, and stored closely beside one another. At sea, they would shift slightly as the ship rolled. The movement was expected, and cargo was arranged to limit it as much as possible. However, 9 of those barrels would later be found empty. They were made from red oak, a more porous wood than the white oak used for most of the others. It is possible that alcohol gradually leaked through the wood or escaped as vapor. That fact would become central to one of the most convincing explanations for the ship's abandonment. Before departure, Captain Briggs supervised preparations. Fresh water had to be stored. Food had to be sufficient for the crew and family. The condition of the sails, hull, pumps, and rigging had to be considered. There were no weather forecasts delivered by radio. A captain could observe the sky, study available reports, and use experience. But once beyond the coastline, he depended on instruments, calculations, and whatever conditions the Atlantic provided. On the 7th of November, the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor. She first traveled to Staten Island, where she waited for more favorable weather. The early days of the journey were difficult enough to delay the ship. Then, on the 16th of November, the Mary Celeste finally entered the open Atlantic. Behind her, New York gradually disappeared. Ahead lay several thousand miles of water. For those aboard, the voyage would have developed a steady routine. Sailors worked in watches so the ship could be operated throughout the day and night. Someone had to remain at the wheel. Sails had to be adjusted when the wind changed. The ship's position had to be estimated and recorded. Meals were prepared below deck, where every loose object had to be secured against the movement of the vessel. At night, lamps gave only limited light. Beyond the deck, the ocean became almost invisible. There may have been moonlight on some evenings, and heavy cloud on others. The sailors would hear water passing the hull even when they could no longer see the waves clearly. The surviving log records, ordinary navigational information rather than fear or crisis. The weather was sometimes rough. The vessel encountered strong winds and difficult seas. These were serious conditions, but not extraordinary for an Atlantic crossing in November. Captain Briggs continued eastward toward the Azores. Those islands provided an important reference point. Rising from the Atlantic, they could help a captain confirm his position before continuing toward the Strait of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean. Yet navigation in 1872 was never perfectly precise. A captain estimated longitude using a chronometer and determined latitude through celestial observation. Cloud cover could prevent accurate readings. Currents pushed a ship away from its expected route. Small errors accumulated over several days. The Mary Celeste's chronometer may also have been inaccurate. This possibility becomes important because Briggs may have believed his vessel was in a different position from the one it actually occupied. A captain who thought he was dangerously close to land could interpret the same weather, water, and damaged equipment very differently from a captain who knew he was safely offshore. By the 24th of November, the Mary Celeste had reached the waters near the Azores. The last known entry on the ship's slate placed her near Santa Maria Island. A later reconstruction suggests that Briggs may have believed he was slightly farther north and east than he truly was. The night had been difficult. There had been strong wind and rain. The ship had taken on water. At least one pump was unreliable. The cargo hold may have contained alcohol vapor. And somewhere nearby, partly hidden by poor visibility, lay an island surrounded by a rocky coastline. None of these factors alone required the crew to abandon ship. Together, they may have created a dangerous misunderstanding. The final known record associated with the Mary Celeste was made on the morning of the 25th of November. It indicated that the ship had come within sight of Santa Maria Island. After that, the written trail ends. There's no surviving message saying that the crew feared an explosion. There is no final sentence describing water rising in the hold. No witness survived to explain what happened. From this point onward, every reconstruction must remain a theory. Still, it is possible to imagine the practical questions facing Captain Briggs without inventing a dramatic scene. He knew the ship had experienced rough weather. He knew water was entering the vessel. He may not have known exactly how much. One pump had been dismantled or was otherwise unavailable. The Mary Celeste had recently carried coal during earlier voyages. Coal dust and debris could collect in the bilge and interfere with the pumps. Work had also been done on the ship before departure, and the condition of the system may have been difficult to judge. The sounding rod found on deck suggests that the crew had been measuring the depth of water. A captain standing beside an uncertain pump could not simply look through the deck and see the entire interior of the hull. He depended on measurements. If those measurements were unreliable, he faced a difficult decision. Water in a ship does not remain still. As the vessel rolls, it moves through the lower spaces, changing depth from one side to the other. Cargo and internal structures make accurate assessment more complicated. Briggs may have believed the Mary Celeste was taking on water faster than it truly was. At the same time, the alcohol cargo may have produced a strong smell. 9 barrels were later found empty. Alcohol vapor inside the hold could have seemed like a warning of fire or explosion. A wooden ship carried many possible sources of ignition. There were lamps, there was a stove in the galley, metal fittings and tools could produce sparks. Whether the concentration of vapor was actually high enough to explode is uncertain. But Captain Briggs did not need a modern chemical analysis to become concerned. He only needed to believe that the cargo might ignite. The hatches may have been open to ventilate the hold. This could help explain why some openings were found unsecured when the Dei Gratia's men boarded days later. Now consider the situation from the captain's position. The ship has passed through rough weather. Water has entered the hold. A pump cannot be trusted. The cargo may be leaking. The air smells of alcohol. Visibility has made navigation difficult. Land may be closer than expected. Your wife and 2-year-old daughter are aboard. You have one small boat. Abandoning a ship at sea is normally a last resort. A lifeboat is more vulnerable than the vessel it leaves. It has limited supplies, no shelter comparable to the ship, and little ability to survive worsening weather. An experienced captain like Briggs would have understood that clearly. This is one reason the abandonment remains so difficult to explain. Whatever he perceived must have seemed more dangerous than entering the open boat. But leaving the ship did not necessarily mean permanently giving it up. There is a more cautious possibility. Briggs may have ordered everyone into the boat while keeping it tied to the Mary Celeste. They could wait at a short distance while the hold ventilated, while the water level was observed, or while they attempted to approach land. In that situation, the captain would take the sextant, chronometer, and ship's papers. The crew would lower the boat. A line would connect the smaller craft to the larger ship. The Mary Celeste would continue to provide some protection and perhaps tow the boat through the water. Then the line could fail. A sudden gust might fill the sails. The ship could accelerate. A wave could pull the boat backward. A damaged rope could break beneath the strain. Once separated, the difference in speed between the two vessels could become impossible to overcome. The Mary Celeste, with sails still raised, would move away. The boat, carrying 10 people, would remain behind. There would be no engine, no radio, no way to summon help beyond sight or hearing. The crew could watch the ship become smaller against the horizon, and the Mary Celeste would continue eastward without them. This explanation fits much of the physical evidence. It explains the missing boat. It explains the missing navigational equipment and papers. It explains why personal possessions remained aboard. It explains why no violence was required. It also explains why the ship itself survived. But it cannot tell us what initially convinced Briggs to leave. Nor can it tell us what happened to the people in the boat. No confirmed wreckage was found. No body was identified. No message reached the shore. The Atlantic kept the final part of the journey. After the Mary Celeste was discovered, the salvage crew attempted to bring her to Gibraltar. This was not a simple journey. The vessel had damaged sails and problems with its equipment. The crew aboard her was small. The Dei Gratia and Mary Celeste could not remain beside each other every moment. At times, Weather separated them. The sailors on the abandoned ship had to manage with what remained. They pumped water, adjusted canvas, and guided the vessel southeast. Each evening, darkness settled over two ships moving independently through the same region of ocean. The men aboard the Mary Celeste knew that 10 people had recently vanished from the spaces around them. They probably discussed possible explanations. Sailors were familiar with danger, but they were also familiar with stories. Every port carried rumors of storms, wrecks, mutinies, pirates, and vessels found without their crews. The Atlantic was a place of commerce and calculation, but it was also a place where incomplete information easily became legend. Still, the salvage crew completed the journey. On the 13th of December, the Mary Celeste reached Gibraltar. The ship was secured in harbor. Stone fortifications rose above the water. Military buildings and crowded streets stood beneath the large limestone rock that had made Gibraltar an important strategic location for centuries. The arrival of an abandoned American vessel attracted immediate interest. Yet before Captain Morehouse and his crew could receive any salvage payment, a legal investigation had to determine what had happened. The inquiry was overseen by Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar. Solly Flood did not accept the simplest explanation. He suspected crime. That suspicion would shape the investigation and influence the reputation of the Dei Gratia's crew for years afterward. Maritime salvage could be profitable. If a crew rescued a valuable ship and cargo from serious danger, a court might award them a significant sum. The Mary Celeste and her alcohol were worth a great deal of money. Because of this, Solly Flood considered whether the disappearance had been arranged to create a salvage claim. Perhaps the captains of the Mary Celeste and Dei Gratia had cooperated. Perhaps the Dei Gratia's crew had attacked the other vessel. Perhaps there had been mutiny. Perhaps the cargo had been stolen or deliberately damaged. Each possibility required evidence. Surveyors inspected the ship. They examined marks on the bow. They studied stains that some believed might be blood. They looked for damage caused by collision or violence. The apparent stains were tested and did not provide reliable proof of murder. The marks on the bow were not shown to be evidence of an attack. No hidden bodies were discovered. No large amount of cargo had vanished. The theory that the crew had become drunk on the alcohol also had a serious problem. The cargo was not ordinary drinkable liquor. Breaking into sealed industrial alcohol would have been difficult and dangerous. There was no convincing evidence that the sailors had done so. Solly Flood nevertheless developed a theory involving drunkenness, violence, and murder. In one version of his suspicion, members of the crew may have consumed alcohol, killed Captain Briggs and his family, damaged the vessel, and escaped. But there was no proof. The men's known character did not support it, and if the crew intended to escape, taking a small open boat into the Atlantic while leaving a navigable ship behind would make little sense. Attention also fell on Captain Morehouse. He and Benjamin Briggs may have known one another. They had both been in New York before departure. This fact encouraged speculation that the discovery had been planned. Yet the ships had not left at the same time, and their routes and speeds were not identical. Arranging a meeting in the open Atlantic without modern communication would have been extremely uncertain. There was also no convincing explanation for why Briggs would willingly place his wife and child in danger for an insurance scheme. The more dramatic theories required increasingly complicated behavior from people who had no clear reason to participate. Over time, the court's suspicions weakened. No murder could be established, no fraud could be demonstrated, no mutiny could be proven. The salvage crew eventually received a reward, although it was lower than they had hoped. The reduced amount reflected the court's lingering doubts. For Captain Morehouse and his men, this may have felt unfair. They had brought a valuable ship through difficult conditions, yet their reward was accompanied by suspicion. For the families of those missing, the inquiry brought no useful answer. Benjamin Briggs' mother had lost a son. Arthur Briggs had lost both parents and his little sister. The relatives of 7 sailors received no graves to visit. An official process had examined the wood, sails, cargo, stains, ropes, and documents, but the 10 absent people remained beyond its reach. The court could investigate the condition of the ship. It could not reconstruct a decision made on a moving deck hundreds of miles away. The Mary Celeste entered newspapers quickly. An abandoned ship was already an unusual story. A ship missing an entire crew and a captain's family was even more compelling. Early reports contained mistakes. Some altered the number of people aboard. Some changed the cargo. Some described conditions that were not supported by the inquiry. The mystery continued to grow during the following years. Then, in 1884, a young writer published a fictional story inspired by the case. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle. He had not yet become famous as the creator of Sherlock Holmes. The story was titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. Doyle changed many facts. He called the ship the Marie Celeste rather than the Mary Celeste. He altered the crew and introduced murder, racial conflict, and an invented survivor. The story was presented in the style of a personal account. Some readers apparently treated parts of it as genuine testimony. The fictional name Marie Celeste became so common that it is still frequently used today. Over the following decades, writers added further details. A half-eaten breakfast appeared on a table. Coffee remained warm. A cat was said to be waiting aboard. Pipes were found resting beside bunks. The ship was described as completely undamaged and perfectly orderly. These details made the story more vivid, but they were not established by the original evidence. The Mary Celeste became a stage on which each generation could place its preferred fear. In the late 19th century, writers imagined mutiny, piracy, and sea monsters. Later accounts proposed submarines, giant squid, underwater earthquakes, and supernatural forces. In the 20th century, the Bermuda Triangle was sometimes drawn into the story, despite the fact that the ship was found far from the region usually associated with that legend. The distance between history and fiction became difficult to see. This happens often with unsolved events. A true mystery contains empty spaces. Those spaces feel uncomfortable. People begin to fill them. A missing meal becomes a warm meal. An abandoned cabin becomes a cabin left in the middle of breakfast. A damaged but seaworthy ship becomes a perfect vessel on a calm sea. The more complete the imagined scene becomes, the less closely it resembles the evidence. The real Mary Celeste is less theatrical. There was water in the hold. The ship had experienced difficult weather. Its rigging and sails were not in perfect condition. A pump was unreliable. Navigational instruments were missing. The boat was missing. Several barrels had leaked. These facts do not remove the mystery. They place it back in the physical world. And once the ship returns to that world, the disappearance begins to look less like magic and more like a maritime accident whose most important witnesses did not survive. Many explanations have been proposed. Some can be rejected with reasonable confidence. Others remain possible but unsupported. A few fit the evidence well enough to deserve careful attention. Pirates did operate in parts of the 19th century world. Ships could be attacked, their cargo taken, and their crews killed or captured. But piracy is a poor explanation for the Mary Celeste. The cargo remained. Valuable personal belongings were not systematically stolen. There was no reliable evidence of combat. The ship itself was not taken.